Europeans in medieval China were people from Western Eurasia and countries traditionally belonging to the lands of Christendom during the Middle Ages who visited, traded, performed Christian missionary work, or lived in China during the second half of the 13th century and the first half of the 14th century. This coincided with the rule of the Mongol Empire, which ruled over a large part of Eurasia and connected Europe with their Chinese dominion of the Yuan dynasty, whereas the Byzantine Empire centered in Greece and Anatolia maintained rare incidences of correspondence with both the Song dynasty and Ming dynasty of China. The Roman papacy sent several missionaries and embassies to the early Mongol Empire as well as to Khanbaliq, the capital of the Mongol-led Yuan dynasty. It is thought that thousands of Europeans lived in Imperial China during the period of Mongol rule, mainly located in eastern Central Asia in places such as the Mongol capital of Karakoram. European missionaries and merchants traveled around the Mongol realm during a period of time referred to by historians as the Pax Mongolica. The most famous European visitor to China during this period was Marco Polo, preceded respectively by his father and uncle Niccolo and Maffeo Polo. Perhaps the most important political consequence of this movement of peoples and intensified trade was the Franco-Mongol alliance, although the latter never fully materialized, at least not in a consistent manner. The establishment of the Ming dynasty in 1368 and re-establishment of native Han Chinese rule led to the cessation of European merchants and Roman Catholic missionaries living in China. Direct contact with Europeans was not renewed until Portuguese explorers and Jesuit missionaries arrived on Ming China's southern shores in the 16th century. During the Age of Exploration. Background: Hellenistic Greeks. Before the 13th century, instances of Europeans going to China or of Chinese going to Europe are virtually unknown, with a few exceptions. Euthydemus I, Hellenistic ruler of the Greco-Bactrian kingdom in Central Asia during the 3rd century BC, led an expedition into the Tarim Basin in search of precious metals. Greek influence as far west as the Tarim Basin at this time also seems to be confirmed by the discovery of the sample tapestry, a woolen wall hanging with the painting of a blue-eyed soldier, possibly a Greek, and a prancing centaur, a common Hellenistic motifs from Greek mythology. However, it is known that other Indo-European peoples such as the Yuezhi, Saka, and Tocharians inhabited the Tarim Basin before and after it was brought under Han Chinese influence during the reign of Emperor Wu of Han. Lucas Christopoulos presents an argument that the influence of Hellenistic art in China stretches back to the Qin dynasty, before the establishment of the Silk Road. Christopoulos contends that Hellenistic influences in Chinese art was undoubtedly introduced by the period of the Three Kingdoms and the sudden influx of Greco-Buddhist art from the Kushan Empire in Central Asia. Yet ancient ceramics from sites at Khotan bear clear influence from the Hellenistic kingdom of Ptolemaic Egypt, with styles non-existent in Kushan art. This has led Christopoulos to assume the presence of peoples not only from the Greco-Bactrian kingdom but also Greeks, Saka, and Indian people from the Indo-Greek kingdom based at Taxila, at the cemetery in Sampal, 14 kilometers from the archaeological site of Khotan in Lop County, Xinjiang, China, where the aforementioned Sampal tapestry was found. The local inhabitants buried their dead there from roughly 217 BC to 283 AD. Mitochondrial DNA analysis of the human remains has revealed genetic affinities to peoples from the Caucasus, specifically a maternal lineage linked to Ossetians and Iranians, as well as an Eastern Mediterranean paternal lineage, seeming to confirm this link. From historical accounts, it is known that Alexander the Great, who married Sogdian woman from Bactria named Roxana, encouraged his soldiers and generals to marry local women. Consequently, the later kings of the Seleucid Empire and Greco-Bactrian Kingdom had a mixed Persian-Greek ethnic background. Ancient Romans. Beginning in the age of Augustus, the ancient Romans, including authors such as Pliny the Elder, mentioned contacts with the Seers, who they identified as the producers of silk from East Asia and could have been the Chinese or even any number of middlemen of various ethnic backgrounds along the Silk Road of Central Asia and northwest China. The Eastern Han-era Chinese general Ban Chao, Protector General of the Western regions, explored Central Asia and in 97 AD dispatched his envoys Gan Ying to Dakin. Gan was dissuaded by Parthian authorities to venture further than the Persian Gulf, although he wrote a detailed report about the Roman Empire, its cities, postal network, and consular system of government, and presented this to the Han court. Subsequently, there were a series of Roman embassies in China lasting from the 2nd to 4th centuries AD, as recorded in Chinese sources. In 166 AD, the Book of Later Han records that Romans reached China from the maritime south and presented gifts to the court of Emperor Yuan of Han, claiming they represented Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius Antoninus. Historian Rafe de Crispini speculates that they were Roman merchants instead of official diplomats. It is possible that a group of Greek acrobatic performers, who claimed to be from a place west of the seas, were presented by King of Burma to Emperor An of Han in 120 AD. It is known that in both the Parthian Empire and Kushan Empire of Asia, ethnic Greeks continued to be employed as entertainers such as musicians and athletes who engaged in athletic competitions. Byzantine Empire. Byzantine Greek historian Procopius stated that two Nestorian Christian monks eventually uncovered the way of how silk was made. For this revelation, monks were sent by the Byzantine Emperor Justinian as spies on the Silk Road from Constantinople to China and back to steal the silkworm eggs. This resulted in silk production in the Mediterranean, particularly in Thrace, in northern Greece, and giving the Byzantine Empire a monopoly on silk production in medieval Europe until the loss of its territories in southern Italy. From Chinese records, it is known that Michael VII Doukas of Fulin dispatched a diplomatic mission to China's Song dynasty that arrived in 1081. During the reign of Emperor Shenzong of Song, some Chinese during the Song period showed interest in countries to the west, such as the early 13th century Quanzhou customs inspector Zhao Rugua, who described the ancient lighthouse of Alexandria in his Zhefanji. European merchants in China. Marco Polo, a 13th-century merchant from the Republic of Venice, describes his travels to Yuan Dynasty China and the court of Mongol ruler Kublai Khan, along with the preceding journeys made by Niccolo and Maffeo Polo, his father and uncle, respectively, in his travels of Marco Polo. Polo related this account to Rustichello da Pisa around 1298 while they shared a Genoese prison cell following the capture in battle. In his return trip to Persia from China, Marco Polo said that he accompanied the Mongol princess Kokochi in her intended marriage to Arghun, ruler of the Mongol Ilkhanate, but she instead married his son Ghazan following the former's sudden death. although Marco Polo's presence is omitted entirely. His story is confirmed by the 14th-century Persian historian Rashid al-Din Hamadani in his Jami al-Tawari. Marco Polo accurately described geographical features of China such as the Grand Canal. His detailed and accurate descriptions of salt production confirm that he had actually been in China. Marco described salt wells and hills where salt could be mined, probably in Yunnan, and reported that in the mountains, these rascals have none of the Great Khan's paper money, but use salt instead. They have salt which they boil and set in a mold. Quote, Polo also remarked how the Chinese burnt paper effigies shaped as male and female servants, camels, horses, suits of clothing and armor while cremating the dead during funerary rites. When visiting Zhenjiang in Jiangsu, China, Marco Polo noted that Christian churches had been built there. His claim is confirmed by a Chinese text of the 14th century explaining how Sogdian named Mas Argus from Samarkand founded 6 Nestorian Christian churches there in addition to one in Hangzhou during the second half of the 13th century. Nestorian Christianity had existed in China earlier during the Tang dynasty when a Persian monk named Alapen came to the capital Chang'an in 653 to proselytize, as described in a dual Chinese and Syriac language inscription from Chang'an dated to the year 781. Others were soon to follow. In about 1340, Francesco Balducci Pegliolotti, a merchant from Florence, compiled a guide about trade in China, a country he called Cathay, noting the size of Khanbaliq and how merchants could exchange silver for Chinese paper money that could be used to buy luxury items such as silk. Marco Polo mentioned the heavy presence of Genoese Italians at Tabriz, a city that Marco returned to from China via the Strait of Hormuz in 1293 to 1294. The Italian Franciscan monk John of Monte Covino took this same journey in reverse starting in 1291, setting out from Tabriz to Ormuz, sailing from there to China while accompanied by the Italian merchant Pietro de Luca Longo. While Montecovino became a bishop in Khanbaliq, his friend Luca Longo continued to serve as a merchant there and even donated a large amount of money to maintain the local Catholic Church. In Zayton, the first harbor of China, there was a small Genoese colony, mentioned in 1326 by André de Peraus. The most famous Italian resident of the city was Andolo de Savignon, who was sent to the west by the Khan in 1336 to obtain 100 horses and other treasures. Following Savignon's visit, an ambassador was dispatched to China with one superb horse, which was later the object of Chinese poems and paintings. Other Venetians were in China. John of Montecovino had one bring a letter to the west in 1305. In 1339 a Venetian named Giovanni Lord Arno is recorded to have returned to Venice from China. A tombstone was also discovered in Yangzhou in the name of Catherine de Villani, daughter of Dominici. She died there in 1342. The history of Yuan records that a certain Izi from the country of Fulin, initially in the service of Guluk Khan, was well versed in Western languages and had expertise in the fields of medicine and astronomy that convinced Kublai Khan to offer him a position as the director of medical and astronomical boards. Kublai Khan eventually honored him with the title of Prince of Fulin. His biography in the history of Yuan lists his children by the Chinese names, which are similar to the Christian names Elias, Luke, and Antony, with a daughter named Ain Rczz. European missionaries in China, Giovanni da Pian del Carpine and Benedict Pollack, were the first papal envoys to reach Karakoram after being sent there by Pope Innocent IV in 1245. The Historia Mongolorum was later written by Pian del Carpine, documenting his travels and a cursory history of the Mongols. Catholic missionaries soon established considerable presence in China due to the religious tolerance of the Mongols, due in no small part to the Khan's own great tolerance and open encouragement of the development of trade and intellectual avocation. The 18th century English historian Edward Gibbon commented on the Mongols' religious tolerance and went as far as to compare the religious laws of Genghis Khan to equivalent ideas propounded by the Enlightenment philosopher John Locke. Ofil-Kaimish, the widow of Guluk Khan, ruled as regent over the Mongol realm from 1249 to 1251. In 1250 the French diplomats André de Longjumeau, Guy de Longjumeau and Jean de Carcassonne arrived at her court located along the Emile River, bearing gifts and representing the sovereign Louis IX of France, who desired a military alliance. Empress Kaimish viewed the gifts as tributary offerings and, in addition to gifts given in return, entrusted to Louis's diplomats. She sent the French monarch a letter demanding his submission as a vassal. The Franciscan missionary John of Monte Covino was ordered to China by Pope Nicholas III in 1279. Monte Covino arrived in China at the end of 1293, where he later translated the New Testament into the Mongol tongue and converted 6,000 people. He was joined by 3 bishops and ordained Archbishop of Beijing by Pope Clement V in 1307. A community of Armenians in China sprang up during this period. They were converted to Catholicism by John of Monte Covino. Following the death of John of Monte Covino, Giovanni de Marignoli was dispatched to Beijing to become the new archbishop from 1342 to 1346 in an effort to maintain a Christian influence in the region. Marignoli, although not mentioned by name in the history of Yuan, is noted in that historical text as the Frank who provided the Yuan imperial court with an impressive war horse as a tributary gift. On 15 March 1314 the killings of Francis de Pietrialo, Monaldo of Ancona and Antony of Milan occurred in China. This was followed by the killing of James, Quanzhou's bishop, in 1362. His predecessors were Andrew, Peregrinus, and Gerard. The Franciscan Friar Odoric of Pordenone visited China. Friars in Hangzhou and Zhangzhou were visited by Odorico. His total travels took place from 1304 to 1340, although he first returned to Europe in 1330. China's Franciscans were mentioned in his writings. The Itinerarium. John de Monte Covino was officially replaced by Nicolaus de Bentra, who was chosen by Pope John XXII. There were complaints of the absence of the archbishop in 1338. Toffontima sent an embassy including Genoese Italians to Pope Benedict XII in 1336, requesting a new archbishop. The Pope answered by sending legates and ecclesiastical leaders to Khanbaliq in 1342, which included Giovanni de Marignoli. In 1370, following the ousting of the Mongols from China and the establishment of the Chinese Ming dynasty, the Pope sent a new mission to China, comprising the Parisian theologian Guillaume du Préacute as the new archbishop and 50 Franciscans. However, this mission disappeared, apparently eliminated by Emperor Zhu Yuanzhang of Ming. The Ming Hongwu Emperor sent a diplomatic letter to the Byzantine Empire, through a European in China named Niehku-Lun. John V Palaeologos was the Byzantine emperor at the time the message was sent by Hongwu. The message was sent to the Byzantine ruler ruler in September 1371 when Honggu met with the merchant Nieh Yuan from Fulin. The Khanbaliq bishop Nicolas de Bentra is speculated to be the same person as Nieh Yuan. For instance, Nicholas was suggested to have been the same as Nieh Yuan by Emil Brett Schneider in 1888. Friar William of Partok Cosmas, and John de Marignolles were among the Catholic clerics in China. The Oriens Christianis by Michel Loquien recorded the names of Khanbaliq's previous bishops and archbishops. European captives in Central Asia. His travels from 1253 to 1255, the Franciscan monk William of Rubruck reported numerous Europeans in Central Asia. He described German prisoners who had been enslaved and forced to mine gold and manufacture iron weapons in the Mongol town of Bolar, near Talas, Kyrgyzstan. In Karakorum, the Mongol capital, he met a Parisian named Guillaume de Bachia, and Paquette, a woman from the French city of Metz, who had both been captured in Hungary during the Mongol invasions of Europe. He also mentions Hungarians and Russians, and it is also known that 30,000 Alans, a group of Sarmatian tribes, formed the ASUD Guard of the Mongol court in Beijing. Spread of Chinese gunpowder. William of Rubruck, a Flemish missionary who visited the Mongol court of Monkey Khan at Karakorum and returned to Europe in 1257, was a friend of the English philosopher and scientific thinker Roger Bacon. The latter recorded the earliest known European recipe for gunpowder in his Opus Majus of 1267. This came more than 2 centuries after the first known Chinese description of the formula for gunpowder in 1044. During the Song dynasty, the earliest use of Chinese prototype firearms occurred at an 1132 siege during the Jin-Song Wars, whereas the eldest surviving bronze hand cannon dates to 1288 during the Yuan period. Following the Mongol invasions of Japan, a Japanese scroll painting depicted explosive bombs used by Yuan dynasty forces against the samurai. By 1326, the earliest artistic depiction of a gun was made in Europe by Walter de Malmete. Petrarch wrote in 1350 that cannons were then a common sight on the European battlefield. Diplomatic missions to Europe. Riban Barsauma, a Nestorian Christian Uyghur Turk born in Zhengdu, China, was sent to Europe in 1287 as an ambassador for Arghun, ruler of the Ilkhanate and grandnephew of Kublai Khan. He was preceded by Isaac Elamchi, an Assyrian Nestorian Christian who worked as a court astronomer for Kublai Khan in Khanbaliq, and was sent by Arghun to Pope Honorius IV in 1285. A decade earlier, Barsauma had originally set out on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, passing through Gansu and Khotan in northwest China, yet spent time in Armenia and Baghdad instead to avoid getting caught up in nearby armed conflicts. He had been accompanied by Rabban Marcos, another Uyghur Nestorian Christian from China who was elected as the Patriarch of the Eastern Church and advised Arghun Khan to have Barsauma lead the diplomatic mission to Europe. Barsauma, who spoke Chinese, Persian, and Old Uyghur, traveled with a cohort of Italians who served as translators, with Europeans communicating to him in Persian. Barsauma is the first known person from China to reach Europe, where he convened with the Byzantine Emperor Andronikos II Palaiologos, Philip IV of France, Edward I of England, and Pope Nicholas IV to form an alliance against the Mamluk Sultanate. Barsauma also witnessed a naval battle at the Bay of Naples, Italy in June 1287 between the Angevins and the Kingdom of Aragon, while being hosted by Charles Martel of Anjou, whose father Charles II of Naples was imprisoned in Aragon at the time. Aside from his desire to see Christian sites, churches, and relics, Barsama also showed a keen interest in the university life and curricula of Paris, which Maurice Rossabi contends was rooted in how exotic it must have seemed from his perspective and educational background in Muslim Persia and Chinese Confucian teaching. Although he managed to secure an audience with these leaders of Christendom and exchanged letters from them to Aga Khan, none of these Christian monarchs were fully committed to an alliance with the latter. Renewed contacts during the Ming. In 1368 the Mongol-led Yuan dynasty collapsed amid widespread internal revolt during the Red Turban Rebellion, whose Han Chinese leader would become the founding emperor of the Ming dynasty. A formal resumption of direct trade and contact with Europeans would not be seen until the 16th century, initiated by the Portuguese during the Age of Discovery. The first Portuguese explorer to land in southern China was George Alvarez, who in May 1513 arrived at Linton Island in the Pearl River Delta to engage in trade. This was followed by Rafael Perestrello, a cousin of the wife of Christopher Columbus, who landed at Guangzhou in 1516 after a voyage from newly conquered Portuguese Malacca. Although the 1517 mission by Fernão Perez de Andrade ended in disaster and his imprisonment by Ming authorities, relations would be smoothed over by Leonel de Souza, the first governor of the Portuguese trade colony at Macau, China. In the Luso-Chinese Treaty of 1554, the Italian Jesuit missionary Matteo Ricci would be the first European invited into the Ming-era Forbidden City in Beijing, where in 1602 he would publish his map of the world in Chinese that introduced the existence of the American continents to Chinese geographers. He arrived in Macau in 1582, when he began to learn the Chinese language and information about China's ancient culture, yet was unaware of the events that had transpired there since the end of the Franciscan missions in the mid-14th century and establishment of the Ming dynasty. Since that time the Islamic world presented an obstacle for the West in reaching East Asia and, barring the grand treasure voyages of the 15th century Admiral Zheng He, the Ming dynasty had largely pursued policies of isolationism that kept it from seeking far-flung diplomatic contacts. The Ming Empire was at least willing to engage in conflicts nearby, however, when it offered relief forces to its tributary state Joseon Korea against invading Japanese forces in the Imjin War.